Welcome back to this week's Parent Parsha series, Parshat Pinchas. I wanted to just share one very small and short idea with you. One of my early memories with my grandmother, Allah Shalom, was how much she loved the movie Fiddler on the Roof. And I used to enjoy watching Fiddler on the Roof with her, and she would enjoy watching it with any of her grandchildren who were willing to watch it. Um, and it evokes such a strong memory of family and time with her. Um, and one of the reasons that it got me thinking about it is that in this week's Parsha, we are introduced to the story of Benot Safchad, whose father has died, and they too want a nachala, they too want an inheritance in the land of Eretz Yisrael. All the lands are being divided by lottery, and they come to Moshe and ask Moshe, what about us? What about our inheritance? And it really got me thinking about the notion of tradition, the notion of inheritance. And my mind quickly went to Fiddler on the Roof, which is the story of daughters and Tevye and his struggle with tradition in an evolving and changing world. And the other area that we see tradition, particularly I think in this week's Parsha, you could come up with lots of different places that there's an intervention point, or an interaction point between tradition and the story that's being related. You could think about it in terms of the Chagim and our history. You could think about it in terms of the transition of power that's basically being set up here from Moshe to Yehoshua, and Hashem reminding Moshe that his time is going to come to an end and he's going to go up and look and see the land of Eretz Yisrael, and that Yehoshua is going to take over for him, and the need to prepare to have a transition of power so that there is a continuation of tradition from one leader to the next, from one generation to the next generation. And at the same time that I'm thinking about tradition, I'm thinking about this week's Parsha and how it always seems to keep coming back to this notion. I was thinking about the fact that I was listening to a shir by Rabbi Leibowitz, who gave in Kol Yom Rishon this week, or this past week, about the history of Zmirot and some of the different halachic implications about whether or not you use Shem Hashem and where it come from, and it being a very old minhag, and that the notion of adding shira to a Shabbat table elevates it, and him reflecting on the fact that in his own personal family, maybe Zmirot were not as commonplace until pandemic, when they really had more time just their family. And it really got me thinking not just about the notion and the beauty of song and Zmirot, and what it adds to a family, what it adds to any situation, what it adds to a Shabbat table, but also about the fact that it's an old minhag, that it's something that's passed down, and the importance of valuing minhagim from family to family, and thinking about as parents and as grandparents, are we talking enough about minhagim, customs that existed in our parents' home and our grandparents' home, and ways in which we think about in a very proactive, thoughtful way about continuing those things into our children or into the next generation, whatever that looks like at this juncture, but thinking about it in a very active way, not necessarily in a passive way. Sometimes we imagine that if we do things, our kids will naturally, or the people that we are surrounded by, will pick it up, and not recognizing that more often than not, sometimes we also have to verbalize it. We have to articulate it. So, for example, in our, we kind of go back and forth in terms of Zmirot, but I know that when we sing one particular family Zemer, and that's from my husband's family, he always comments that this was the tune that his Zaidi used to sing, and he would have a certain way that he sang it at a certain tune, really putting that tradition, putting that family history. I think it really grounds children in a very profound way. It connects them to who they are, who their past is, and helps them also create a certain sense of ownership in terms of what they carry themselves within them, their own, like what their genetic kind of like history is, and then what they have to contribute moving forward, and what people kind of expect of them in a positive way. And so I just want to, that really is where my mind was heading, this notion of thinking about the way in which we parent and infusing tradition and whatever is important to us from our personal families, and bringing it into our homes in a very live and active way that has meaning and has richness. And I think that is important for kids who are looking for meaning, particularly as it relates to religion, right? Where it's not just something that's like random or esoteric, or it's just something we do, but really helping kids connect to it in a meaningful way. This is something that I used to do with my parents. That's something that I used to do with my grandparents, and trying to connect them to that in a very meaningful way. And the other piece that I just think is something to add to it, and I guess I'll make a plug for Zmirot, is the fact that there's something very beautiful about song, but there's something also very powerful about song. There's a lot of scholarly literature written about the ways in which song has the capacity to build environments in a very positive way. So first of all, not everybody feels that they're so comfortable using language. And so song allows people from all different backgrounds, oftentimes, to feel like there's a space for them to do something, to participate, to connect. And I think in that way, we're making space for lots of different people to be able to literally come to the table in a sense of comfort. There's also something about the notion of being able to listen to what somebody else is singing, where someone else's key is. I don't have a particularly strong musical voice. That is absolutely a challenge for me, but it's also a challenge for my husband, who has a much better voice and who's able to keep on key, that sometimes he'll pause and be like, I should adjust the key, right? And thinking about the way in which we actually engage with the people around us, and thinking about how other people are engaging, because it's a harmony, it's a community, it's a group, and thinking about ways that we can introduce Zmiro, which I think for many people oftentimes sometimes feel a little bit uncomfortable. It's like, well, when do I start them and when do I add them? And is it weird? What if the other people don't do Zmiro? And I think being able to think about adding it, and realizing it's really deep in our tradition, and it's a positive thing for lots of wonderful different reasons, and it really has the ability also to elevate our Shabbat tables in a really beautiful, wonderful way. Speaking of tradition, so I have to say, on Monday, I felt very stumped by this week's Parsha treats. I was like, I don't know where I'm going. I'm looking through the Parsha. I'm like, I'm very stumped. I just like, I wasn't feeling it. And then I took a pause and I was like, inheritance. What am I doing about inheritance and nachala? And then I kept coming back to inheritance, and I was thinking about family traditions. And so for this week, I'm encouraging people to bake something or cook something that is a family traditional food. So I was leaning towards like biscochos. In the end, I think I'm going to go with two recipes. One is my nana's recipe. She has like a old nut bread recipe that is delicious, and everyone in our family, respective families, make it. And I decided to also go with my great aunt Lucy's lemon pound cake recipe. For those of you who are related to me, Aunt Lucy was an excellent baker, and it's still a recipe that's kind of made it all the way through. I will admit I did a little bit of a tweak to it, so hopefully none of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren will give me too hard of a time for that. I think that also the bracha that's given to Pinchas is a bracha of shalom, and so you could do anything peace-related. So I thought maybe like, oh, maybe I should do something with pieces. You could. I didn't, only because Eitan's like, I feel like that's a stretch. But I think that that is definitely a place to go, because this is a hard parsha. We also have Korban Tamid in this week's Parsha, so you can bring back your lamb and your sheep that we've had in previous Parshas, but you could also think about some way to communicate this beautiful notion of the things that we do in routine, the things that are Baboker and Ba'erev, right? The beauty of the Tamid is the consistency with which we come to Torah and mitzvot every day, day in and day out, that it's not the big chagim which we come to also at the end that we're just obliged to engage in, but it's really the daily acts of devotion that connect us and keep us committed to Torah and to Hashem. So those were some of the things that I was on my mind in this week's Parsha, and I encourage you to take it in lots of creative ways, and I look forward to seeing what you all do for this week's Parsha treats. I hope everybody has a wonderful and meaningful Shabbat, and are starting to enjoy the summer without being too hot from the unbearable heat that we had the last few days. Shabbat Shalom.